that it becomes like a signal that class is beginning. I hope to not fall into that trap. I hope that we can quiet our hearts first and put our first things first and open in prayer before we can move on from it. So if you'll join me, let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We have five objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to do these 5 things. What?
Oh, shoot, yeah.
By the end of class today, you should be able to do these 5 things. You should be able to describe government efforts to investigate the loyalty of United States citizens. Okay, so today we talk about how the Cold War is going to be prosecuted or carried out stateside. And we have seen in American history other moments where Americans get really nervous about American loyalty. I think we saw it during World War I when you had like people demanding that you kiss the flag to go show you're a good American, or becoming very suspicious of like people that looked like the enemy or acted like the enemy. But in previous cases, we've seen that mostly driven by public opinion. In the Cold War, at least in today's episode, we're going to focus on how actually the government takes that mantle and the government begins to investigate the loyalty of the United States citizens. And that's a different level. And I think if this class makes you uneasy about maybe a person's civil rights or your ability to have an unpopular opinion, I think you can feel uneasy today. I think this is fruitful ground for discussion, like how much is too far. Second, you should be able to describe the investigations of alleged communist influence in the United States. We'll talk about a couple of cases in particular where we were pursuing communists in influential positions. Number 8, you should be able to explain the policy of brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is the idea of going to the brink or pushing it until it explodes. Brinkmanship was a policy where both sides were ready to go to war as soon as the other person crossed the brink. So you're playing at the edge of disaster, right? That's brinkmanship. You should be able to describe American and Soviet actions that caused the Cold War to spread around the world. Even though today we focus on Cold War at home, we're also going to talk about how our actions here ended up carrying out elsewhere. Okay, girls. And then lastly, you should be able to summarize the impact of Sputnik and the U-2 incident on the United States. Let us turn to Roman numeral number 6. In the early years of the Cold War, which is where we are in the timeline right now, in the early years of the Cold War, many Americans believed there was a good reason to be concerned about the security of the United States. The Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the communist takeover of China, it shocked the American public, fueling a fear that communism would spread around the world. At the height of World War II, there was about 100,000 Americans claiming membership in the American Communist Party, a political party like Republicans, Democrats. 100,000 people in the Communist Party is not a lot. It's not even big by minor party standards. But it's enough that they got some interest. Some people feared that the first loyalty of these American communists wasn't even America, but instead the Soviet Union. Strongly anti-communist Republicans began to accuse Truman of being soft on communism. So in March of 1947, Truman decided to issue an executive order setting up the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which its most important piece was the Loyalty Review Board. The Loyalty Review Board was a government organization whose job it was to investigate government employees. Its purpose was to investigate government employees, and anybody who is disloyal to the American government would be fired. Now, I think this this is an odd piece of American history because on one sense, yes, if you're going to work for the American government, you can't be disloyal to the American government, right? Like that gets anybody fired from their job. If I work for St. James Academy, but it turns out that I'm secretly selling basketball plays to Aquinas, like under the cover, like sliding them down there to coach. I'm fired for that, right? Like that's just not okay. And the American government approaches its own employees like that. However, you also get certain constitutional protections. Protections, in fact, from the government. Like, you don't get the rights from the government, you're being protected from the government for things like your freedom of speech and your freedom of assembly. Those First Amendment rights. I mean, America's favorite amendment is the First Amendment. It's the one that protects all the other ones. And you have the right to an unpopular opinion. You have the right to think things that other people don't like. That's one of the, prices of freedom, that you have to be in the same country with other people who don't think like you. And if the Loyalty Review Board is investigating Americans for having, unpopular opinions, or even anti-American opinions, those constitutional protections still apply to those people. But the Loyalty Review Board drafted a list of 91 organizations that were seen as subversive. And if you were a member of them, you were unfit to serve in government and were fired. From 1947 to 1951, government loyalty boards investigated 3.2 million employees and fired 212 of them as security risks. Honestly, that doesn't sound like a good ratio to me. Investigate almost 3.2 million people and you found 212 that were unfit to work there. Another 2,900 resigned rather than be investigated. From there, we could reach a couple of possible conclusions. 2,900 people either were subversive communists and just didn't want to be investigated, so they quit before they got there, or 2,900 people thought, no, the government can't investigate me, and if they're going to, then I'm going to quit because you just don't get to, investigate that. The answer is probably that there is 2,900 different reasons why people would rather quit than be investigated, but we see that comes out of the Loyalty Review Board also. Whenever anybody studies this era of the Cold War, they will come across one committee known as HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. It's a committee of Congress, so it's made up of congressmen, and they do their investigations on stuff. And the House Un-American Activities Committee first made headlines in 1947 when they turned their eyes not towards government employees, but to other people that could be influential to Americans. Most famously, they went after Hollywood. They said, Americans love watching movies, but what if there are communists in Hollywood who are poisoning the brains of Americans, making pro-communist movies and making people think communistic thoughts. It was kind of the idea of the House Un-American Activities Committee. They believed that the communists were sneaking propaganda into films. The committee was even able to find some pretty overt evidence that were pro-Soviet films. However, and this is an important detail, the pro-Soviet films were made during World War II, when the Soviets were our military ally, when we were fighting on the same side as them. I mean, Hollywood made a lot of movies, pro-war movies. You'd include your fighting buddies along the way with this. Making a pro-Soviet film during World War II totally makes sense. But then suddenly it's 3 years later and the world has moved and those things that used to be right are suddenly very not right. And everybody's thinking you're a communist to go be in it. But they had been made in a different era when the Soviet Union had been a U.S. ally. The House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed 43 witnesses from Hollywood, called 43 people to testify in front of Congress. Testify in front of Congress. Now, many of the witnesses were seen as friendly witnesses. They were called, they appeared, they answered the questions, they cooperated, gave the answers they thought were right. Most of the people called were friendly witnesses. and there was a lot of support that said that there were communists working in the film industry. For example, movie star Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper is this guy right here in the picture. Gary Cooper was a one-time heartthrob who was kind of aging out by 1947. He was no longer really a Hollywood heartthrob. But Gary Cooper, still a major star. And when he testified in front of HUAC, he said, I've turned down quite a few scripts because I thought they were tinged with communistic ideas. And the committee leans in like, oh, really? Go on. And they, what were the names of the scripts? And Gary Cooper's like, oh, I can't remember. Okay, what movie studios were they with? I can't remember. Who were the producers? Who were the directors? Who script writers? Who offered you the scripts? Nah, I just can't remember. Now, I think we can look at Gary Cooper and we can reach a couple of conclusions. Either he was hiding and covering up for people, or that he actually couldn't remember. He was kind of dingy. Maybe. I look at Gary Cooper and I think, I'm not an expert. He's like this. Hollywood actors of the 1940s are not my subject as a student of history, but I think Gary Cooper was the kind of guy that would tell people what they wanted to hear. And once they wanted details, he didn't have anything else to tell them. Like you think, oh yes, quite a few scripts. Really, like what? Okay, really no scripts. I think he was just kind of like wanted to get along and then kind of got trapped in the lie and couldn't get out of it. I can't prove that, but that's my opinion. The reason I tell you this story is because the House Un-American Activities Committee identified 10 people which were unfriendly witnesses. They come the nickname the Hollywood 10, and they refuse to testify. Now, if Congress calls you to testify, I would encourage you to take seriously their call. If they subpoena you and order you to testify and you refuse, then you go to jail for that. And the Hollywood 10 went to jail for refusing to appear in front of Congress. It caused outrage. People so they don't appear. Like everybody gets the Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate yourself. But nevertheless, they got blackballed. When they got out of jail, they never worked in Hollywood again. These were like some major actors and directors and script writers. They never got another job in the business again. Their careers were ruined. They were public embarrassments, suspected communists. But in reality, we don't know if they were communists or not. They never appeared. They just refused to show up. The Hollywood 10. It would eventually spill over to about 500 actors, writers, producers, directors, got blackballed and could no longer work in their field. As Hollywood tried to rid itself of communists, Congress decided that Truman's Loyalty Review Board wasn't going far enough. And in 1950, Congress passed the McCarran Internal Security Act, named after Senator Pat McCarran, this large man here by the fireplace. The McCarran Act made it unlawful to plan any action that led to the establishment, I don't know how you would ever enforce this, the establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship in the United States. Now, it doesn't mean that you actually had to become a dictator. It just means you had to plan it. Truman vetoed the bill. He says, in a free country, we punish people for the crimes they commit, but not for the opinions they have. Congress said, yes, but it's a crime to have this opinion. And Congress actually overturned the veto. It's fairly rare that Congress will go back to vote on a vetoed bill and be able to get so many votes to overturn a presidential veto. It does exist, but it's pretty rare when it happens. But the McCarran Act was passed over Truman's veto. In 1948, a communist spy named Whittaker Chambers, I don't have Chambers' picture up here, but a communist spy named Whittaker Chambers was testifying about his time as a spy. So he's an American, but he's been spying for the Soviets in America. So he's a communist spy selling American secrets to the Soviets. And in his testimony, he named another person in the spying chain, this guy named Alger Hiss. This is a crazy name. His parents named him Alger. Whatever. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Hiss were holding their precious baby boy and say, sweetie, what should we name him? Let's call him Alger. Oh, yes, that's wonderful. Come on. All right, anyway, Alger Hiss was named as a spy for the Soviets. Now, to support this claim, Whittaker Chambers produced a strip of microfilm of documents that was said that Hiss had typed on his typewriter. Okay, this sentence sounds ridiculous to us today in the 21st century, so I need to walk you through a couple of details. First, what is microfilm? Here's a young Richard Nixon looking at a film strip. You see he's got his magnifying glass right there. Microfilm was a way of storing documents in a pre-digital era where they would literally just have a document camera, take a picture of it. You could then shred the document. You had a photographic, and photography's good. Like you could really reproduce that document well. And then you would have this microfilm, and they would keep those film strips on file. That's microfilm. And they had documents that were spy documents that was said that Alger Hiss had typed on his typewriter, and they could prove that it was his typewriter. Now again, this sounds ridiculous today, because if you type a Google Doc and you print it on Caleb's, computer, it could look like the same Google Doc as if you print it off on Nick's, right? Like they just look the same. However, typewriters don't work like that, particularly typewriters of this era. If you come down and you hit the A button on your typewriter, these things are arms with the letter A on it, and you hit a lever and it swings the arm up and it pushes through a ribbon of ink and it puts the impression of the A right on the paper like that, right? And over time, all these little swing arms would just sort of start to wobble. It's a machine. They mechanically get loose or they get a little bent, or sometimes the letters would hit a little higher and the K key would always hit just a little higher than the rest of the words did. And over time, a typewriter would develop a fingerprint. And you would kind of know your typewriter. Actually, over time, you would kind of know the P is a little crooked on that one. Or the capital P doesn't hit straight. It's gotten a little bent or warped on it. So every typewriter would produce its own fingerprint. And it was standard forensic evidence to trace a document back to a particular typewriter. In this case, Whittaker Chambers produced microfilm saying that spy documents were typed on Alger Hiss's typewriter, and the only person that ever uses your typewriter is you, so Alger Hiss is the spy in the chain for the communists. Alger Hiss denied it. The lead prosecutor was young Congressman Richard Nixon, who sort of became famous for his prosecution of Alger Hiss. Shouldn't persecute people. The kind of the way the story goes is that Alger Hiss probably guilty. I think we look at, particularly since the Soviet Union has fallen, the government's gone out of business, they've opened up all those documents. They found, Alger Hiss was totally a spy. But the statute of limitations had passed, and you actually couldn't send him to jail for spying. But he did go to jail for perjury. Perjury is lying under oath. And that gets a person in jail every time.
How long?
It would depend. Perjury. Okay, this is a good just rule of life. This isn't about American history. This is just like life. The cover-up is worse than the crime. The cover-up is worse than the crime. So like hiding the crime is worse than actually doing the crime. The example I like to give, do you know Martha Stewart? Like the baking lady, the really tall woman that makes cookies and whatever else. She had the cooking show with Snoop for a while, right? Martha Stewart is a convicted felon and spent jail time for perjury. She was being investigated for some business, for some white collar crime, insider trading. The details aren't important. But she lied under oath, and when it was discovered she lied under oath, she went to jail for it. She served prison time because perjury is a serious crime. So when you see that baking show with her and Snoop on it, one of those two is a convicted felon. It's maybe not the one you're expecting, but anyway, let's see, where are we at? The next people I want you to meet are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. This is Julius Rosenberg. This is Ethel Rosenberg. And Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were accused of being spies. Here's kind of the way this goes down. In 1949, September of 1949, the Soviet Union successfully exploded an atomic bomb. They did it secretly. Actually, this is a great story that meteorologists in Western Europe were doing their just like atmospheric testing, just testing the weather. And they're like, oh, all of the air is suddenly charged with atomic particles. How about that? And they're like, yep, somebody blew up a bomb. Soviet Union. Like they did it secretly, but it's hard to hide an atomic explosion. In 1949, Americans learned the Soviet Union had exploded an atomic bomb. Now, we knew that the Soviets were planning an atomic bomb. This wasn't a surprise. We knew that they were working on it. However, we kind of knew how long it takes to invent an atomic bomb. And we expected the Soviets were on pace to do it in like 7 more years. That they cut the timeline by so much, they're like, oh, the Soviets have gotten our secrets. Like, we know there's some spies working now. That's like the shortest wait to do that. So people began to wonder if communist supporters in the United States had leaked the secrets of the bomb. And a spy case seemed to confirm that suspicion. In 1950, a physicist named Klaus Fuchs admitted giving the Soviet Union information about an atomic bomb. The information probably enabled the Soviet scientists to develop their own atomic bomb years earlier than what it should have been. In the investigation, Fuchs named Ethel and Julius Rosenberg as their go-between, as the people that trafficked the documents. Okay, so we got to talk about these two for a second here. Julius, the guy on your right, was an army engineer, but he'd actually gotten fired from his job because he was a communist. You can't fired from the job. Can't work for the army. Can't work for the government if you're a communist. So he refused to testify in this trial. This is a little different than what the Hollywood 10 had done. In a court, people who are accused of a crime always get the right to remain silent. So if you get arrested a lot, you know how this goes. Like, right, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Your right to remain silent is your Fifth Amendment right. It's the right to not incriminate oneself. So, if you're driving to school, you're going 130 on the roundabouts. You're driving like a sophomore boy hitting those corners, right, as fast as you can. And Officer Pierce comes up behind you and says, Ireland, is there any reason you're going 120 miles an hour on the roundabouts? Ireland's response can be, and not say anything. You ever hear somebody say, like, don't talk to the cops, right? That's actually your legal right to do so. You have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. You don't have to say anything. If they say, Ireland, why do you have 3 dead bodies and an AK-47 in the back seat? Ireland could just say nothing. She has a right to remain silent. She doesn't have to say anything, incriminating or not. She doesn't have to make up an excuse like, oh, I just found him there. It's Emma's car. Like, she doesn't have to do any of that, right? She could just be quiet. Let the cops do the work on it. Julius Rosenberg was called to testify, and he refused. He says, I'm going to take my Fifth Amendment rights. I don't have to go testify. Besides, the only reason you're calling me to testify is because my wife and I have committed 2 crimes. The first one is being Jewish, which is not a crime. And the second, that we're communist, which is actually also protected by the Constitution. And I don't have to, he doesn't say I'm innocent, but he's just like, I'm not going. I don't have to. You're not going to make me. Which is 100% his right. When the police officer says you have the right to remain silent, that's as true in the speeding ticket, as true as, being accused of being a communist spy. Because the Fifth Amendment rights are yours. Ethel, however, we should also, go with this, for holding radical beliefs. Julius Rosenberg, let's say this, let's get this out there, did believe he was a spy. He was trying to transfer documents. Actually, the record is pretty clear on this. that he is guilty. Guilty, 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 guilty. Julius Rosenberg was trying to be a spy, was actually involved in espionage of selling atomic secrets. His wife, Ethel, basically not. The evidence is that Ethel is more or less innocent. She might have known that her husband was trying to do this. There's not much evidence that she did know. There is some evidence, again, it's not super clear, that she might have even typed up a document or two. But that is not the same thing, not on the same level as like selling secrets. It's a different level. Julius, almost certainly guilty. Ethel, more or less innocent. However, the government decides in their prosecution of the Rosenbergs that they're going to make Ethel the mastermind in this. Okay, I don't know if there's any future attorneys in this room or not, but you will study the Rosenbergs case. I'm going to give you the preview on it. The prosecution decided that if they made Ethel seem like the mastermind strategist behind this spying ring, that they can charge her all the way up with the death penalty. The American government knows that she's not really guilty, but they're going to go after her as if she is guilty. The reason is because they want to get Julius to crack. They want to get Julius to say, no, she's innocent, I did it all, I'll tell you the whole spying ring. They want to break him with Ethel. The American government seriously underplayed, seriously underestimated how committed these two were to their cause, and that neither one of them were going to take the stand. Neither one of them were going to say anything, and they were going to force the American government to execute them both, which is ultimately what happened. I don't know why you're laughing at that. This is going to get even crazier. So, if you get arrested a lot and you're getting your Miranda rights read, you also know the second part of the Miranda rights says you have the right to an attorney if you cannot afford an attorney, one to be provided for you by the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. An attorney works for you. The attorney does not work for the court. The attorney does not work for the judge or the justice system. Your attorney works for you. Even if you can't afford that attorney and one gets appointed by the court. In that case, the court tells them, you're the attorney, but that attorney works for you. That's a universal protection, right? That's the way that trials work. These two had an attorney. However, the attorney, the Rosenberg's attorney, was telling the prosecution secretly, giving the FBI like, oh yeah, this is all of the secrets of their case. Here's how they're going to defend themselves this way. This is what they're going to do. Wildly illegal, like a huge violation of the way like attorney-client privilege works. Huge, like disbarred, go to jail. That's a bad deal. The prosecutor, the defense attorney was selling all the secrets of the defense, not selling, just giving them to the prosecution. The attorney works for them, but was not working for them, was basically working for the court. You get what's called attorney-client privilege. If Ireland goes and gets her attorney and she says, oh yeah, those 3 dead bodies in the back seat, I killed them all. I hit them with my car. I backed up. I hit them again. And then I shot him with the AK, right? If she tells her attorney that, the attorney cannot say anything. It's like the confessional. It is private protected law, right? Your attorney works for you. It's attorney-client privilege. That the Rosenberg's attorney were turning around and handing J. Edgar Hoover all of the details of the case. Wildly bad. They were convicted. When they're sentencing, the judge said that the crimes they had committed were worse than murder. Because in murder, one person gets killed. They're selling atomic secrets that could end humanity. Are you kidding? Way worse than murder. And they were executed. They became the first U.S. civilians executed. It's crazy. And this is why you'll study it if you go to law school. Because it's a huge mishandling of justice. They are both guilty and yet framed. It's Weird deal. It's also the only time I know, there could be other cases that I don't know about, but it's the only time that I think we can say pretty much for certain that the American government executed an innocent person. They knew Ethel was not the mastermind. She was barely involved, if involved at all. But carried through on executing a more or less innocent American citizen by the American government.
The Rosenbergs are also in the song "We Didn't Start the Fire."
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So what was their motivation for that?
So they were U.S. citizens, Stalin communists. Like in reality, they thought the Soviet Union was right, and they wanted America to become like the Soviet Union. Okay, I need everybody to stand up for 1 minute. Maria's still asleep. I'll start the time once everybody's standing. There we go. Okay. Subpoint C. The most famous anti-communist activist, this guy, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was a United States senator with kind of a bad reputation as a senator. Was seen as not a very good bill writer. Didn't caucus together very well. People didn't invite him to co-sponsor a lot of bills because he was kind of a sucky person, just kind of a crappy senator. So people just didn't. He had a bad rep. And in 1950, he realized that if he's got to go get reelected in 1952, he needs to do something to launch his career. And he says, you know what Americans all get behind? Anti-communism. So that's going to be the horse I'm going to ride. So he, in 1952, looking for such an issue, McCarthy began accusing people in the government of being communists, you might be seated, and saying that the communists were taking over the American government. McCarthy then went on to make one unsupported accusation after another. The guy just began accusing people of being a communist. At various times, he would hold up pieces of paper and say, in my hands, I have a list of 57, or later 81, or later 205 names of people working in the State Department who are secret communists. Now, the State Department is the cabinet position whose job it is to go deal with other countries. They represent American interests abroad. And if there are communists in the State Department, then they might not be representing American interests, and that could be a problem. McCarthy would hold this list. I have in my hand a list of 205 members of the State Department who are communists. And somebody would say, really? Let me see those names. And he'd say, I'll show you later. And he never did produce the list. He never would show anybody any of the names. And people began to get suspicious that there were no names, that McCarthy was making this all up. In 1954, McCarthy made accusations against the United States Army. And when he starts calling out the Army, people say, well, we can't have communists in the Army. Let's get to the bottom of this. And they give him the moment that he'd been waiting for. And they start televising what becomes known as the McCarthy hearings, where he starts accusing members of the armed forces of being communist. One by one, he would pull people in and say, are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Say, no. And he just kept at it. And it became, after a while, pretty clear that McCarthy did not have a list. He did not have any evidence. He was full of garbage. And people kind of like, the Senate's like, we didn't really like McCarthy beforehand. And now we find out he's just a big old bully. He's a big old bully. The public lost interest in McCarthy. And the Senate actually censured him, which is kind of like the biggest punishment the Senate can give to another senator. They strip him of the ability to give any speeches. He doesn't get to sponsor or co-sponsor any legislation. He writes a bill and hands it in, and the committee is like, oh yeah, McCarthy, we'll see. And just everything would die in committee. He would still get to vote. He's still a senator, he gets to vote, but there wasn't much power left to him. McCarthy died 3 years later, and he died basically as a mess of a person. He was a broken man suffering of alcoholism, basically drank himself to death in a downward spiral of his career and life. Kind of a sad ending for a sad piece of American history. That term today, though, exists. I heard somebody whisper in the back, McCarthyism still survives. You'll hear people saying like, oh, that's McCarthyism. That's basically like accusing people specifically of disloyalty, but sometimes you hear other stuff, but with no evidence at all. People just making it up like, yeah, this is McCarthyism. Like you're just trying to ruin people's reps. You don't have any evidence of that. It's called McCarthyism. It comes from Joseph McCarthy. Roman numeral number 8. When the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb in 1949, President Truman had to make a terrible decision. He said, okay, well, the Soviets now have atomic weapons. I guess we're just going to need bigger atomic weapons. I mean, if they can make a big bomb, what if we make a freaking huge bomb? Scientists had kind of had this theory for a while, saying that you could take hydrogen, and by splitting a hydrogen atom, the energy that would released was far, far bigger than the atomic bombs. So it becomes known as the hydrogen bomb or the H-bomb. They estimated that such a bomb would have a force of 1 million tons of TNT, or 67 times the power of the bomb that they dropped on Hiroshima. But scientists are like, that's not even a moral thing to do. You would kill so many people. The destruction would be so big. That's not, we could do it, but we're not going to do it. Despite such concerns, the United States entered into the deadly race with the Soviet Union to see which country would be the first to produce the H-bomb. USA, we were the first ones that did it. On November 1st, 1952, the United States won the race when it exploded the first H-bomb in Yucca Flat, which I think is Nevada. However, the American advantage lasted less than a year. By mid-1953, the Soviets had also done the same thing. By the time both countries had the H-bomb, Dwight D. Eisenhower was president. His Secretary of State, this guy over here, John Foster Dulles. If you fly into Washington, D.C., you might fly into Dulles Airport. It's named after him. John Foster Dulles was starchly anti-communist. He's Secretary of State, so he's the one that deals with all the other countries. Secretary of State represents American interests abroad, and he is very against communism. For Dulles, he says, the Cold War isn't about besting your enemies. It's about the survival of the American way. It's the defense of freedom. We have to win it. He proposed the United States could prevent the spread of communism by promising to use all of its force against any aggressor nation. If the United States gets into another war, under Dulles' theory, it's going to be a nuclear war. You're going to pick that fight because we will win it. Any fight is a nuclear fight. The willingness of the United States to go to the edge of all-out war became known as brinksmanship. Under this policy, the United States actually cut its Army and Navy. We actually had fewer soldiers than sailors. But we did increase the size of our Air Force because we would use it to go deliver nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union did the same thing. The threat of nuclear attack was unlike any that the American people had ever faced. The reality is that even if a few atomic bombs reached their target, even if just a couple of them went off, millions of civilians would be alive 1 minute and dead the next. And just like civilians, just innocent people. Fear of nuclear war became a constant in American life for 30 years. As the nation shifted to a dependence on nuclear arms, the Eisenhower administration began to rely heavily on a newly formed agency called the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA is the agency in charge of spying on other countries. The CIA also tries to carry out covert, secret operations to weaken or overthrow governments unfriendly to the United States. It would argue that yes, we could go to war to go defeat our enemies. But what if we could, instead of going to war, could take them down from the inside? We'll subvert them. We'll get their governments to fail, get our enemies to be crushed without, American fingerprints on it. Well, let's talk about how this goes down. Subpoint B. One of the first covert actions took place in the Middle East in 1951 when the Prime Minister of Iran, this guy named Mohammad Masada, I think is how you say his last name. Mohammad Masada was part of a government that had deposed the Shah. The Shah was like a prince who ruled over Iran. The Shah had been deposed, and Mohammad Masada had taken over. Mohammad Masada was prime minister. He was reasonably democratically elected. But in his actions of refiguring how Iranian life would be done, he nationalized the oil fields. Okay, that term nationalized means that the oil fields used to be privately owned, but the government took them. The oil fields were mostly British, but Masada nationalized the oil fields. The British are like, hey, those are our oil fields. You can't just strip them from us. And they're like, yes, we can. So the British responded by dropping a boycott on Iranian oil. So they stopped buying Iranian oil. The British were their biggest trading partner. So all of a sudden, the Iranian economy is like lost its customer. Their economy is starting to fail. It's going downhill. And the United States says, oh no, if Iran fails, then that's the fertile kind of ground that communism will come out of. And the Soviets will swoop in and save the day in Iran. And we're going to have another communist country. So the CIA secretly sent a force in to depose Masada. They sent millions of dollars to anti-Masada supporters who overthrew their democratically elected government and reinstalled the Shah back into power, who was not democratic, right, at all. He's basically more or less a king, to rule over Iran. And the plan worked. The coup d'etat was successful. And the Americans deposed a democratically elected leader and put back in a monarch. The Shah returned to power. First thing he does is takes all those Iranian oil fields and gives them back to the British, returns them all to Western companies again, and everything goes back to normal. But not communist. Subpoint C. Under Iranian control. I thought I put that up there. Subpoint C. Okay, now we have to turn back the clock a little bit more to the late 1800s, the end of the 19th century, kind of when this class began. When our MUSH timeline began. Late 1800s, global coffee demand. Suddenly, people start drinking coffee. It surged. And the country of Guatemala, down here, Central American country of Guatemala, decided to go promote agriculture, to go keep up with coffee demand, and then later like bananas and stuff. So what they did was the Guatemalan government took all of this land that had been held by the native people, say Native Americans, they're like Central America, but native Guatemalans, whatever. Like the indigenous people had all of this just sort of communal land. Guatemalan government takes all of it and begins selling it off to agriculture companies who can go farm it. The biggest buyer over time became the United Fruit Company, which was an American fruit company. They made, grew bananas and, mangoes and whatever in Central America. And actually, United Fruit Company became so big that they ended up owning significant land holdings in Guatemala and then other Central American countries. They actually became the largest landholder in Central America, and in some places had more power as a landowner than the governments did as like actual governments. The term people would use for this was banana republics. They're like, oh yes, it's the Banana Republic of Guatemala because the banana company has more power than Guatemalans do. So Banana Republic is not just a store in the mall for skinny people. It's also like a phase of Central American history. Anyway, in 1944, Guatemala had a revolution where the people overthrew their government, and they installed a new government that stripped the UFC, the United Fruit Company, and other companies of 200,000 acres of American land and in turn gave it to the peasants. Now, the new president was actually anti-communist, but the CIA says, oh yes, taking land and giving it to the people, that's a communist move. And so the CIA decided they were also going to do, just like they did in Iran, and take over covert plans to go oust this government. So in response, the CIA trained a rebel army, which then invaded Guatemala. It wasn't an American army. It was a Guatemalan and other Central American army, but they rebel army to invade Guatemala. This new army, so then the Guatemalan army refused to defend the president. They basically said, like, no, go get him. It's a bad dude. I don't know if he's a bad dude or not, but the army refused to defend the president. And the answer was that Guatemala became a military dictatorship. The CIA switched what had been like a movement of the people, ousted them, and replaced them with a military dictatorship, but not a communist one. So, win for the CIA. Subpoint D. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union had no well-defined way for one leader to succeed another. So for a couple of years, the Soviet Union sort of had like a committee of leaders. It didn't work very well. Over time, one person emerged named Nikita Khrushchev. Like Stalin, Khrushchev believed that communism would take over the world. But unlike Stalin wanted to go conquer the world with bullets. Khrushchev is like, no, we're just going to use influence. Like, we're going to use just economics. People are going to love communism. They're just going to become communist on their own. Khrushchev believed that it was a winning formula that would work. And he favored a policy of peaceful coexistence in which two powers would compete economically and scientifically, but not necessarily militarily. That was kind of the Khrushchev approach. For Americans, this is awesome. We couldn't work with Stalin. Dude's crazy. Khrushchev seems like a man we can deal with. While tension between the countries did remain high, Khrushchev seemed to signal an era of uneasy cooperation. The Soviets went so far as like recognizing West Germany. They're like, okay, fine, we'll admit that's a real country. And they concluded peace treaties with Austria and Japan, and it looked like the Khrushchev era was a peaceful era for the Soviet Union. Eisenhower even said, hey, if we're all being cool with each other now, I would propose what he calls the open skies proposal. Mr. Khrushchev, I will give you a map of the world with every U.S. military base on it. We'll tell you where all of them are. We want the same map from you. You tell us where all your bases are. And then we'll have an open skies proposal where you can fly your jets over the top of them. We won't shoot them down. Please don't shoot ours down. And we will photograph each other's military bases. And we will just be, open skies, no secrets. We can all see what each other's militaries are doing. This will preserve peace because we'll all be able to play fairly here and preserve peace. Open skies proposal. Khrushchev's like, that sounds like you want me to just allow spying, and no, if you fly over American airspace, or if you fly an American plane over Soviet airspace, we're going to shoot it down. So, no, I'm not going to just let you spy on me. So rejected the open skies exchange. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO, right? Remember our maps here? West Germany joined NATO. It's this, that's not blue. West Germany joins NATO. And then the Soviets say like, oh man, this NATO thing, these capitalist countries are teaming up even closer to us than ever. And so they form the Warsaw Pact of all of those alliance countries with them. So the Warsaw Pact comes as a response to increasing power of NATO. Subpoint E. In 1955, the same year that Eisenhower proposes the Open Skies initiative, Great Britain and the United States agreed, different part of the world, that they were going to help the country of Egypt do some flood control on the Nile River, to go put in a brand new dang-it at Aswan, a city on the Nile. So they're going to build a dang-it there so they can do flood control. So they offer to go give them the money to go do so. However, the head of Egypt, this guy right here, Abdel Nasser, says like, oh, the Americans are going to give us money to go build a dang it on the river. I wonder if the Soviets would give us more money. So he goes over to Khrushchev and he's like, hey, how about you give us more money than the Americans? And the Soviets are like, oh yes, we would like you to take Soviet money and be friends with us. So they offer them more money. And the Egyptians go back to the Americans. They're like, hey, Soviets upped the price. Are you better friends to us than they are? And Dulles, like, you go to hell, and withdrew the offer of the loan. And so we're not going to help you. We're not going to be played off of our enemy like that. Nasser says, like, wait, what the what? And so Nasser then wants to go stick it to the West for rejecting their offer. And Nasser responds by nationalizing the Suez Canal. Okay, this is a weird piece of world history that you didn't study. The Suez Canal was a Panama Canal, Suez Canal, that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Gulf of Suez, which if we're up on the blue map, opens up to the Red Sea. It's a way that people in the Mediterranean can get ships into the Indian Ocean without going all the freaking way around Africa. Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was built and managed by the British. Because the Americans withdrew their aid, they go and try to stick it to the West by nationalizing the Suez Canal. Who hit the Suez Canal the most was not the British. It actually hurt the Israelis the most, who depended on it for trade. So the Israelis get miffed, and they go and invade Egypt. This is the Sinai Peninsula. That's the little triangle hanging down part between Egypt and the rest of Asia. Israel comes in and invades to go try to take the Suez zone. The British and the French were also outraged and sent in troops, and it looks like there are 3 different countries ready to go fight the Egyptians over this. The UN is called in at the last minute. They got to send everybody home. But Egypt kept control of the canal. Roman numeral number 10. In the competition for international prestige, Soviets leapt to an early lead in what becomes known as the space race. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets successfully launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. This is Sputnik, they made 2 or 3 of them. The actual Sputnik, I think, is burned up in the atmosphere by now. But Sputnik was the world's first artificial satellite. It traveled around the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour, circling the globe every 96 minutes. And when the Soviets do this, it was considered a triumph of Soviet science. My dad remembers this as a kid. He says that he remembers that you could go out on a clear night and look up at the night sky and you could actually see Sputnik passing overhead. Oh, I've told him, I was like, there's no way you could see. Sputnik's the size of a basketball. You just cannot see basketball in outer space. Nope. It's just you cannot see Sputnik. Sputnik the only thing it did was prove that it could get up there, and it had a radio signal that was just a beep, beep, beep. It was almost like a proof of concept. We can get up there, the mechanics will work, and they will send a radio signal back to America. It did no observations. It did nothing but fly and beep. But my dad insisted you could see it up there. And what I actually just found this out not too long ago. What you couldn't see Sputnik. But behind Sputnik was the rocket that launched it, which was just slowly burning up in the upper atmosphere of the Earth. So you couldn't see Sputnik, but you could see the flaming space trash flying behind it. You could actually see that from Earth. So the Soviets set up Sputnik first. And the Americans freak out, do what we always do with something like this. Say oh, American schools are failing us. Everybody needs to study more math and science. And they tell you that your only job can be an engineer, and it's the only thing you're allowed to go dream of is engineering. So America freaks out about our education program. I'll talk more about that in another class. Until we go develop our own satellite. We go and we prepare to launch our next satellite, or our satellite, to go rival Sputnik, and huge failure. It actually falls off the launch pad and explodes on the ground, it never gets up in the air. It turns out the Soviets also had some failed launches, but they didn't tell anybody about it. The Americans failed publicly with TV cameras on it, so everyone's Americans can't do it. It's kind of embarrassing. Turns out the Soviets also did. We finally did launch up our satellite called Explorer 1 in 1958. After Eisenhower got the Open Skies plan rejected, the CIA decided that they were just going to go ahead and spy on the Soviets anyway. Like, you don't want to let us do it? We'll just spy in a way that you can't get us. And they developed a new technology called the U-2 spy plane. The U-2 spy plane flew very, very high. So high, actually, that the atmosphere was so thin that pilots had to breathe with breathing equipment on it. There wasn't enough oxygen up that high. The U-2 spy plane had infrared cameras that would go take pictures from very, very high distances, but take exceedingly clear photos of the ground below. They flew so high they were above Soviet radar. They couldn't even track them up that high. Now, eventually, Soviet radar did get good enough to find them, but they also didn't have surface-to-air missiles that could shoot up that high. So they were just flying higher than they could get got. And so they start launching these in 1955. However, by 1960, Americans begin to get a little worried. We've been doing this for 5 years. We're pretty sure the Soviets are tracking us. We know that they can't shoot us down, but eventually they will, like the science will get there. So by 1960, they're like, all right, it's time to put the brakes on the U-2 program. Eisenhower said that he was going to discontinue the flights and had scheduled another kind of open skies thing with the Soviets. Like, we're going to have one more meeting, we'll try to do this, cancel the flights, because we're going to try to go do this legally. John Foster Dulles convinced Eisenhower to do one more trip. The last time, 4 hours after Francis Gary Powers entered Soviet airspace, it was not a surface-to-air missile, but a Soviet plane had come up and shot down his plane. Now, scientists had knew, the Army, the military had known, actually this was a CIA plane, this wasn't a military plane. The CIA had known this was a possibility. So they gave Francis Gary Powers a little bottle of cyanide. The American government does not tell people to kill themselves. No suicide missions, that's not a thing. But they can give you the suicide and say, you'll know what to do. It was kind of a moot point. They figure if anybody shoots down the U-2 sky, hell, the crash is going to kill them. Landing is going to take everybody out, so they can't even worry about it. Plane crashed into the earth, and Khrushchev called up Eisenhower, said, Mr. President, we had an American plane crash in the Soviet Union. What's up with that? And Eisenhower's like, oh yeah, it's a weather plane. They always say it's a weather plane. It's doing science, meteorology, just studying the old atmosphere. Yeah, we knew we'd lost one. Sorry about the wreck. Khrushchev says, yeah, weather plane. Yeah, it's a bad deal. Hey, we have the pilot. He's alive. And it's not a weather plane, and we've got your camera, and we've got all your film, and we've seen that you've been spying on us, and this incident is like, he canceled the summit. And all of a sudden, Khrushchev was like, I wanted to work with you guys. Turns out I can't work with you guys. It was a new era in the Cold War. Khrushchev demanded that Eisenhower stop the flights and apologize. Eisenhower agreed to stop the flights. He was going to stop the flights anyway. But Eisenhower would not apologize. So Khrushchev called off the next summit and withdrew his invitation to Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union.